Good morning. Good afternoon to everybody, and great pleasure to be contributing today to this wonderful event. Very sorry in some ways that we're not all together in person, but I think we know that this online platform often affords opportunities for people to participate who might not be able to do otherwise. So I'm joining you today from the wonderful city of Bath, where I live, down in the southwest. My apologies for my voice. I'm slowly recovering from a non-COVID illness, but because of that, I am at home and not in the hospital, and therefore I hope that our technology will survive this and be sufficient to provide you with what I hope will be a helpful talk. So I may have spoken to some of you before through this conference or through smaller groups, but what I thought I would try to do is to just look at where we are with genetics in relation to cardiomyopathy at the moment, and in particular focusing on how genetic testing is being delivered through the NHS and how patients access genetic services. So this was Sally Davis's famous quote, and when she became a great sort of advocate of the role of genetics in healthcare, in her role as Chief Medical Officer. And she made this rather bold statement about the importance of genetics, saying that this was to the 21st century what infection was to the 20th. I think her successor, Chris Whitty, may well dispute that, having been given the task to manage this pandemic, which has brought infection right back in. But in fact, much of the capability that's been built to deliver genetics and genomics in the NHS are utilised in the fight against the COVID pandemic. And I'll make a brief mention of that as well as I go along. So together with the Cardiomyopathy UK charity, we produced some excellent leaflets that I would recommend. And perhaps those who aren't able to listen to the talk today may be signposted towards these. So these outline the basic principles of genetics, going back to first principles of cells and chromosomes and genes, but also go on to talk a bit about genetic testing. So I'm not going to go into that level of scientific detail today. As I say, I'm going to try and focus much more on the what actually genetics means for your family and what it means in terms of the care of you as a patient. So my designated role, I'm a professor of medical genetics based here in University of Bristol and University Hospitals. And I'm one of a team of clinical genetics consultants operating in the north part of the southwest region. So we have another team, for example, of geneticists based in Exeter, providing care for Devon and Cornwall. And there are 23 regional genetic centres throughout the UK. And wherever you live, you will be part of the catchment area of one of those genetic centres. These are often specialist or tertiary regional services, but they do, and we do deliver clinics through local hospitals. So for example, as I live here in Bath, I will see patients in Bath so they don't have to travel to Bristol, and colleagues will be seeing patients in Gloucester, Cheltenham, Taunton, Yeovil, etc. So although these are centralised, linked to laboratories, they do have the capacity to deliver services in a more locally devolved way. And we also work very closely with other specialists. So in this context, closely colleagues at the Bristol Heart Institute, cardiologists, cardiothoracic surgeons, cardiac nurse specialists, and also with the laboratory, who here in Bristol is actually based on a different site, where we work alongside scientists, bioinformaticians. And this we call a multidisciplinary team, I think is absolutely vital to the management of conditions like cardiomyopathy, where we require this very close and important communication between the different specialties. What bit do we actually do as clinical geneticists? Well, our role is as consultants is the diagnosis of genetic disorders. And so in this case, we're talking about cardiac conditions, and that includes using genetic testing to make those diagnoses. A very important part of our role is to provide information regarding those disorders to both our patients or clients, but also to other healthcare professionals. So we are a point of contact for information. And then for many families, our genetic counsellors, who are trained rather differently, they come from a scientific background with then a master's in genetic counselling, have a particular remit to talk to patients about genetic conditions or about the risks for them, for their family members, and to talk through with them the sort of complex issues around testing. We recognise that for all genetic conditions, and cardiomyopathy, I think, really epitomises this, there is a significant impact of the fact that this is a hereditary or genetic condition that we might not see in relation to other medical disorders. And these include feelings for both the affected individual, but also for other family members, that include sometimes a sense of guilt. There may be conflict arising where there's blame attributed because a particular genetic condition runs in a particular part of the family. And there can be significant grief, particularly when there is a very serious event, such as the loss of a family member. And this sort of circle of guilt, blame, conflict can really be very powerful and important to recognise in the case of a hereditary condition. So what do we actually do? Well, we see patients in clinics, but if we can, we also try to get as much information as we can before we see patients. And in some centres, there are designated admin teams who will collect that information, either through the MDT service or by direct questionnaire or by a telephone call, so that as much information can be collated before we have a clinical contact. Why do we do that? Well, we might need quite a lot of extra additional information, such as the family history, what testing may have been undertaken already in a family member. That may be somebody living in a different part of the country or even a different part of the world. We may need to find information and indeed arrange investigations from a post-mortem if there's been a sudden death. And having the opportunity to undertake some investigations prior to a clinic appointment might actually be very beneficial and open up all sorts of opportunities. So then in the clinic appointment, and that may be with a geneticist or with a genetic counsellor or with a specialist nurse, there will be a discussion of the condition, assessment of what the risks are to that individual and indeed to the wider family, and a discussion of whether or not genetic testing is appropriate or feasible. The availability of genetic testing depends on the availability of a DNA sample, and if there has been no DNA sample stored, then genetic testing will not be possible. And this is something that is unfortunately quite a barrier to genetic analysis in some families. Follow-up is often by delivering results from genetic testing and onward referral. So in our cardiomyopathy cases, that may well be referral into a specialist multidisciplinary team for further evaluation, where perhaps the referral initially came through from primary care or from a cardiologist working more locally. If a predictive test result is positive for both adults or for children, we would generally recommend onward referral into a specialist service for at least an initial assessment. And we do MDT discussion at any point in this pathway. So it might be at that the initial referral is made in an MDT, or it could be that is the result, that the genetic findings need further evaluation, and the case will be tabled for further discussion. So this is what a sort of MDT team meeting looks like. This is some of the members that make up our team here in Bristol. So we have genetic counsellors, geneticists, cardiac nurse specialists, and we also have researchers. So we have Jules Hancock in the picture here, who has particular expertise, who can help us in the interpretation of complex results. And we have good digital access so that we can review investigations both locally and those from hospitals around the region. So I think very different to genetic services from perhaps services in other specialties is that we do work with families. So most genetic services will have a family file number, for example, and any individuals within a family referred in will come under the same file number. And that allows for us to cross-reference important information. We are ever mindful of the importance of confidentiality, and we don't share information without people's permission. But a typical referral might look something like this. We have an individual who's shaded there in the darker colour within the family tree, and this is the nomenclature that we use for drawing up a family tree. It's sort of universally interpreted. We have 3 generations in this family. The males are squares, the females are circles, and the dark colour shading denotes somebody who is affected. And the referral is quite likely to come in requesting information about the effect that this diagnosis has on the rest of the family. So what would genetic testing be? What would we be trying to do? Well, we're trying to find out if there is and what is the particular genetic finding in this family that has caused cardiomyopathy. And many of you know that the DNA code is made up of 4 different letters repeated in many, many different ways. And there are 3,000 million letters of DNA code. And it may be that just one of these letters, 1A or 1T or 1C, is in the wrong place within that DNA sequence, and that is altering the way the gene is working and causing cardiomyopathy. And to find that particular gene change involves extensive investigation in the laboratory. If it works, then it can be extremely beneficial and valuable. So this is an example where a patient with an arrhythmogenic right ventricular dysplasia has had a genetic test, and this diagram shows that there's been a swap of a C and a T letter in the DNA code, and that is felt to be the variant, the pathogenic variant that has caused this disease. And anybody who's tested who doesn't have that finding within the family is unaffected, and anybody who does have that sequence change or that variant finding would be predicted to have or to develop that disease. So where the variant is detected, it's extremely reliable and it can be very powerfully predictive. Where you don't have a genetic finding, it does not mean that it's not there. It just means that it's somewhere in that code and hasn't shown up on that particular test. It doesn't mean it's not genetic. It just means we haven't found the answer as yet. So there is also a lovely leaflet from Cardiomyopathy UK outlining the basic principles of genetic testing and the again, reiterating that testing is trying to find the genetic cause, but not finding that does not mean that it isn't genetic. It doesn't mean it's not hereditary. It just means we haven't got there yet. So why would we want to know what the genetic basis of a person's cardiomyopathy is? Well, first and foremost, it may confirm the diagnosis. So sometimes patients are seen who have features that might suggest a cardiomyopathy, but there may be some other factors. And the question is this actually an environmental myocarditis or some other cause, or is this a genetic cardiomyopathy? Very important is working out what the pattern of inheritance is for the family. So is this something that will affect somebody's children or siblings or parents? Does this help to identify people in the family who have the condition? So this is called targeted screening. We carry out genetic testing and only screen the individuals who are known to be at risk. And that might be by echo and ECG. And more importantly, perhaps looking to the future, is the recognition that the genetic subtype, if you like, of cardiomyopathy might have implications for a particular treatment. And perhaps the best example of that is knowing that some types of dilated cardiomyopathy, particularly associated with arrhythmias, might be an indication that raises the appropriateness of having implantable defibrillator. So this is targeted therapies, that is to say, drugs that work for particular genetic subtypes, but part of something that's called stratified or personalized medicine, which is that instead of saying everybody with cardiomyopathy with HOCM has this treatment, it's saying that individuals have their own genetic makeup that means that different drugs might work better or worse for them, and these genetic subtypes might be the first step on that ladder towards understanding a really tailored individual approach to therapy. I think there is a misunderstanding about what we mean by genetic. Genetic does not necessarily mean inherited. So whenever a genetic disorder is diagnosed in the family, it is naturally assumed that this has been inherited from the previous generation. But in fact, many of these mutations occur for the first time in an individual, and they have not been inherited from their parents. We call this a new mutation or new dominant variant. And that's important because we would normally advocate screening for all first-degree relatives, but it may be that when we come on to do genetic testing, we find that neither parent carries the variant. This is a new finding in this individual, and if they are an adult, they may have children of their own to whom they may pass the condition. So genetic does not necessarily mean that it's inherited, but it may mean that you can pass it on. There are the different types of inheritance, and I won't go through these in detail. Most cardiomyopathy is dominantly inherited. That means that there is a 50-50 chance of passing on that gene to any offspring or children. Some of the pediatric conditions, some of the rarer metabolic conditions may have a recessive inheritance where both parents are carriers contributing a copy of the gene, and the child has a double dose and is therefore affected. And then we see this unusual pattern of inheritance called X-linked inheritance, which tends to affect males but to be carried by females, for example, their mothers. And this is important to understand because the information given to families will be very different, and their requirement, for example, for screening will be different depending on the pattern of inheritance. So this is a very typical referral for a patient with a family where there are a number of individuals who have cardiomyopathy, and the genetic testing undertaken is using what's called a gene panel. That is a number of different cardiomyopathy genes. And what is found is a change in the gene called GLA. And the GLA gene encodes for an enzyme called alpha galactosidase, and this is the important finding in a disease called Fabry's disease. And Fabry's disease is linked to cardiomyopathy. The difference here is that this is an X-linked condition. So rather than the normal standard 50-50 risk to affected individuals, the differences depend on the gender. And so a female has a 50-50 risk of passing this on to any sons, and her daughters have 50-50 risk of being carriers, but it will be different for an affected male. And their daughters will all be carriers, but none of their sons will be affected. So there's a big difference there to the information that's given to the family. So a cardiomyopathy gene panel endeavours to encompass all the genes that are known to cause cardiomyopathy. And there are now many, many of those. This is a diagram just showing all genes that are linked to cardiomyopathy. And there really are more of them than it would be feasible to analyse on a gene panel. They may have only been recorded once, but there are some genes, and that pink section that looks like a quarter there is the titin gene. And we know that this is one of the very important genes linked to cardiomyopathy, for which we see a lot of variants. So what can we do in terms of laboratory testing has been enhanced over the years by the changes in technology. So these are techniques known often collectively as next generation sequencing. And really, this is all about the kit. It's all about the technology. And as technology has improved, the ability to look at genes has improved. And now we're moving on from these targeted gene panels, so something we would have called a cardiomyopathy gene panel with up to perhaps 100 pre-selected genes, into something called whole exome sequencing, and most recently now, whole genome sequencing. The difference between those is just the amount of genetic information that is analysed. The whole genome will be the entirety of the genome, including every bit that's coding and non-coding, and is a very, very much, is a big jump up in terms of the amount of data that is being analysed. But the switch to whole genome sequencing is being undertaken currently in the UK through the NHS Genetic Services. So in the case of another typical referral, we have a case where sadly the referral is after the loss of a family member, and the question is about screening for children. And we would say that without prior knowledge of what gene this is, that those individuals are likely to be at 50% risk and would need to be screened. But if we were able to do genetic testing, we may be able to identify whether all of them are at risk, none of them are at risk, or maybe some. So genetic testing is done on DNA. It's usually done from a blood sample. It goes off to the laboratory and a report comes back from the lab. And this is what a standard report might look like. And increasingly, patients are now being given a copy of their report. And they're obviously quite difficult to understand. They include a lot of additional information that the clinician may need to help them with the interpretation of the finding. But a lot of that information is very complex, is very scientific, and it's unlikely that most patients are going to be able to go through that without the help of a geneticist or a genetic counsellor. Nonetheless, many people do want to have their results in full. And so that is now an agreed process that where patients request the result in full, we will pass that on. So the problem really with this type of testing is that the more you look, the more you find. And actually, as families are investigated, sometimes again and again over the years, what we actually find are multiple variants, that cardiomyopathy isn't always a single gene disease. There are multiple genes involved. And that can be difficult to interpret. Sometimes we have a gene that we know about and is very well characterized. We understand the gene very well, and we think it's very highly predictive within a family. But sometimes we find other genes that are much less well understood. And these can perhaps be interacting, but where it's not clear if that gene alone is found, what would the significance of that be? And this has developed into use of a term that you might come across in your reports or in the letters that you receive about VUSs. This is something called a variant of uncertain significance. Now, I sometimes have slightly flippantly called it a very unhelpful statement. These are variants where it is simply not possible to say, is this definitely causing the particular condition? Is this the cause of the cardiomyopathy or not? And it's important to get this right, because if we say that this is a clearly causative variant and somebody's discharged on the basis of testing, that would be unhelpful. But it would also be unhelpful if somebody was incorrectly assigned cardiomyopathy status on the basis of this variant and therefore had a lifetime of screening and possibly even therapy and intervention. So the laboratories have taken a very responsible approach to this, and that is to only report variants that they are very clear are pathogenic. And the difficulty is that you start out with this very, very large number of sequence changes, and you have to go through some sort of filtering process to get down to perhaps one or two variants that are clearly diagnostic and can be used for clinical care. So I know people get very frustrated by how long genetic testing has taken in the past, and that's because of this innate complexity. And for many families, these will be unique variants that are unique to their families. But there is a plan to speed this up, and the advances in technology have allowed for that. But perhaps more importantly, so has a very, very substantial investment from the NHS to do this. So whole exome and whole genome sequencing are not entirely interchangeable. There's really are that not only do you read more of the DNA, so that's like going through the book more comprehensively, the telephone directory, it also means you go through it many, many, many times over. This is called the number of reads. It will increase the likelihood that you find things you don't really understand. There may even be things you don't really want to know about. And there are different terms that people use for incidental or additional findings. These are findings in the DNA testing that you may not have expected, or they may be extras that you do want to know about. And the incidental findings, if you like, are the unexpected, what you weren't expecting to find. And that would be true for many investigations, for an X-ray, for example. Additional findings may be by request. And with whole genome sequencing, patients have the option to find out about certain other important genes that might have implications for their health, such as familial hypercholesterolemia and certain cancer genes. So important for this kind of testing, more than ever, is informed consent. You need to know that your DNA is being tested, and you need to know why. You need to know what the implications are for you, for your family, for the future, any insurance implications. and you need to know what that test might show. And it may be that it's not the right thing for everybody to undergo testing. There may be times in their life when it's appropriate and times when it isn't. And that needs to be a personal decision, and it needs to be supported by appropriate counselling. Very important to protect vulnerable, and I particularly think in this case of children and young adults for whom the decision to be tested may be made by a parent rather than by them themselves, and important to make sure that that's done so in the right format with all factors being taken into consideration. We have some concern about the lack of counselling support when patients access genetic testing through online services such as 23andMe and other companies that offer testing. This is not equivalent to the testing that is offered through the NHS, and in some cases we've found it to be very misleading. So just to conclude, the big developments in the last few years have come about through a number of initiatives. The first of these was the development of the 100,000 Genomes Project, the legacy of the Olympics, and then rolled out through successive years with a drive to try to improve the amount of genetic testing, the volume of genetic testing, and the quality of genetic testing available in the UK, but also to push forward with research into important areas such as rare diseases that had long been overlooked. So the project recruited patients with cancer and rare diseases, and cardiomyopathy is one of those. And there has been a completion of the sequencing of those initial 100,000 samples. This was required a whole new infrastructure for genetic testing to be established in the UK. And the legacy of that is Illumina, the sequencing company, have now taken the contract to provide a whole genome sequencing for the NHS. And they are based in the UK. They obviously also provide services worldwide. There is a huge emphasis on the importance of secure data. This is of something that was expressed as concern by consenting participants. There's also part of genetics and genomics involves looking at the function of genes as well, and genomics as is part of that. So there are samples that are used together with genetic samples for analysis. So this change is really, really important, because I know that from my meetings with families over the last 3 decades, that a huge frustration has been the inability to access genetic testing, particularly in certain areas. And so as part of this genomic revolution, there really have been big changes to improve the uptake of testing, to achieve that equity of access, and to centralise and rationalise laboratory resources so that it doesn't matter whether you're in Newcastle, Bristol or London, you will have access to exactly the same type of testing, delivered in the same way and reporting the same findings. And this was not the case before. And as part of that, in order to improve the uptake, is devolving that testing to the non-genetic specialists. There simply aren't enough geneticists to go round. And this is called mainstreaming. That is moving genetic testing out of these specialised genetic services into the mainstream specialties, and in particular into cardiology. So there have been 7 genomic medicine service alliances established in England. There's slightly different models in Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And this divides the country up into these sections, all of whom have got an alliance which is the laboratories and clinical services, cancer services, all working together. And the streamlining means that the access to services will be the same in each of these areas. There are obviously geographical differences that arise because of difference in demographics, in populations that need tailored services. But the basic principle is that this achieves some uniformity that hasn't been there before. And the other big change that underpinned this is that genetic testing is no longer bought by a clinician. The investment goes to the laboratory to provide the test, and the cardiologist or geneticist doesn't have to look into their budget and see, have we got enough money to do this? The money is in the laboratory, and the test will be provided if a patient meets the necessary testing criteria. And so for that, there is a National Genomic Test Directory, there is a section on cardiology. Within that, there is a pathway given an R number, which pertains to a particular condition. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathies R131. And that means that if a patient fits the diagnostic criteria for testing, and those are clearly listed within the directory, then testing will be carried out. And that doesn't have a resource implication for the cardiologist or the geneticist. So requesting specialties at the moment are cardiology and clinical genetics. It is still very early days, and the sort of volume of testing is quite difficult to predict. We have a sense that there are lots of families that haven't had genetic testing who would be eligible and will hopefully come forward and be tested over the next couple of years. But it's very, very difficult to predict what that volume of work is. So mainstreaming, as I say, is really all about trying to improve care for patients by taking genetic testing away from our specialist centres and giving access to cardiologists. The importance of the MDT structure is to ensure that that's done in a safe way, that there is a good quality to the delivery of results, that they're used appropriately, but encouraging very much our colleagues in cardiology to take on this very important role. They are able to do, as we did, use these tests to assist with diagnosis, to enable them to work out which family members will need screening, where appropriate to use them in deciding which therapies, and this more kind of personalised medicine approach. We recognise that for cardiologists, this is a big step up. For those who are experts in inherited cardiac conditions, they may feel very comfortable with doing genetic testing, but for many cardiologists, this is a whole new world, and we are very engaged with providing education, workforce development and support, particularly through our genetic counsellors and specialist nurses, to support them to take on this very important role. And what about the future? Well, genetics, clinical genetics, very much is the study of these inherited factors, so the genes that run in families. But genomics is very much more than that, and it's looking at the function of their genes and technologies and therapies, and you know, the one of the reasons for this huge investment in the UK is that all of the data that comes from genetic testing can be accessed through Genomics England and used for research, which drives forward the development of drugs and therapies, and obviously the hope that that improves treatment and outcomes for patients. And there is a wonderful cardiovascular research domain within Genomics England that many of us are involved in, that is already seeing fantastic research that's come about because of the testing that has been undertaken so far. So I'll just conclude really by just recognising the team I've been lucky to work as part of here in Bristol. I do have colleagues who work in similar teams around the country. Self-referral is still quite tricky into genetic services because the structure of the NHS. But I would always say to families that if they're really stuck and they feel that they're not accessing genetics, you can look up your local genetic service online and make a direct approach, and they'll point you in the right direction, at least advise you about how you can achieve a referral. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Good afternoon, Professor Newbury-Ecob. Thank you so much for that presentation. We've had quite a few questions during your presentation. I'll start with, we as parents and our other 3 children were screened for HCM, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but we were told that after this, our children didn't need more screening once they were adults. Given that the responsible gene has now been identified, should our family have genetic screening?
So I'm assuming in this scenario that both parents were screened and were normal, in which case we wouldn't advise for those children to be tested or to have ongoing screening. But yes, if the gene has been identified in the family, if the parent who has the connection to the cardiomyopathy is tested, if the parents don't have that don't have that gene, they cannot pass it on. So I think I probably, I'm always very wary of giving very precise advice without seeing the pedigree, but the broad principle is if you don't have the disease, then we don't advise ongoing screening for children, but genetic testing can be very helpful in establishing whether that parent is an asymptomatic, unaffected carrier of that gene, which might change that advice, yes.
Thank you. The next question here, would you advise genetic screening even if only one person in the family has been diagnosed with dilated cardiomyopathy?
So the criteria for genetic testing has been set to reflect the fact that in an isolated case, there is a lower likelihood of picking up a genetic variant. But in the case of dilated cardiomyopathy, if you do pick up a variant, it might have implications both for treatment, but also for wider screening. And so in some services, they are worried that to test everybody who has dilated cardiomyopathy at the moment as a single case in a family would be a very big burden of work, and tend to be setting some sort of age-related criteria. So maybe that a 70-year-old as an individual in the family who already has children and grandchildren, all of whom are fit and well, may not have genetic testing, but a 35-year-old might. So at the moment, there are the diagnostic criteria for testing through the directory. There are individual criteria set by genetic or cardiac services. And then there's that discussion that you have with your cardiologist based on whether or not there are other findings that might make testing more or less appropriate. But certainly it's not an absolute no, definitely not. It could still be genetic and could be hereditary.
Thank you, Professor Newbury-Ecob. Just time for one more question. Can we ask for a copy of the family tree or pedigree constructed regarding mutated genes found and incidence of cardiomyopathy found in our family?
This is a very difficult question, and I'm very grateful to have this raised. Because of confidentiality, it may be that pedigrees contain information that family members do not wish to share, and therefore there, I think, is some reluctance to do so. What we need to do moving forward is to make sure that we obtain consent for sharing information at the outset, and that pedigrees are constructed and drawn in such a way that that information can be shared without any concerns about sharing confidential information. So it depends a bit on how that information has been collated, by whom, and in what sort of format it is. But we do try to observe our commitment to not sharing any information that we don't have consent to share.
Thank you, Professor Newbury-Ecob. That's all the time that we have today. I really appreciate your time and the delivery of that incredible presentation. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, and I'll join you later, I think.
That's right, a clinical Q&A at 4 p.m. hosted by Joel. We look forward to you joining us again. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.